Welcome to Breaking the Standard, where we are closing the communication and knowledge gap for the small business government contracting industry. I'm Aubrey Gainford, and today we have very special guest Brian Lindholm with us. Brian, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, if you could just introduce yourself for our listeners, that would be great.
Sure, happy to. I'm Brian Lindholm. I'm the managing principal and owner of Fed Savvy Strategies. Been doing the GovCon game for about 25 or so years.
You caught me mid drink. So today I asked Brian actually to come back because Brian does black hat reviews, and A, I don't know what they are, and B, I would really like to understand. I think it would be beneficial for our listeners and people who are trying to look at different ways to improve upon how they respond and prepare for proposals, what it is. So today we're going to talk about black hat reviews and the magic that they offer. I always think about magicians when I hear black hat, so I just thought that was perfect. So can you explain what black hat reviews are?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because it's termed as a color team review. I think I would argue that it's really not a color team review. The red team and green teams and pink teams you see in proposal production, which is fine. It's a necessary process. This is more I always see this as more of an analytical exercise, right? Where you're really trying to do problem solving and real no-kidding competitive analysis, as opposed to just doing a cursory review of who I'm up against. I think that most people see this as I'll call it an MBA SWOT one-on-one type of exercise. And SWOT is a useful analytical tool. We use it all the time in my business. I use it all the time. I think we use it pretty rigorously, but a black hat would be really what it's supposed to be. And the way it's done right is when you use this to truly understand what your competition is capable of and what they will likely do based on the collection of intelligence on them, based on your knowledge of them, and also you have to make some reasonable assumptions about what they can and cannot do in a specific situation. You want to frame this around a specific contract competition, so you can have some sort of guardrails and criteria to evaluate them against, and to understand what you're really up against. Because in the end, the point of it is not just an academic exercise of, okay, well, competitor X can do X, they can do Y, here's what their strengths are, they may have a few gaps that I can take advantage of. But in the end, you need to use that to understand your opposition so that you can make an adjustment and how you're going to approach win strategies. It's actually very similar to what you would see in the intelligence community was called like a red team there. They actually will play out a scenario. Okay, you take the role of Putin, and you take the role of this political figure, and each of the analysts will take on that role to play out a certain scenario in the real world so that the agency can make some better decisions and also educate their decision makers on what to do next. So there's a lot of parallels that aren't necessarily obvious, but you do a black hat the right way, it's closer to that part of playing out a scenario than just doing some basic strength and weakness inventory. So that's really what it kind of comes down to, how it should be done.
Okay, so before I ask you my next question, I'm just curious, like how in depth do you go when you have a potential client and they say, okay, this is the requirement we're responding to, this is what we have, and then this is who we think is going to go after it. And I know you can probably pull a lot of data to see like who's gone after it before, but
Sure.
how in the weeds do you go when you're looking up intelligence on other companies? That's then something that you offer or that you, I guess, use, to prepare your client when you're going forward. Like how far down do you go?
Yeah, well, if you're going to this is where we're getting what I call getting tactical, right? You're
Mhm.
really getting into what the company that you're looking against, or companies rather you're looking against, what they're capable of doing. And there's some basic constructs you can use at a high level to kind of frame how you're going to look at them. We're getting into here, I call the intelligence process, which is, I didn't come up with this, by the way. It's like, okay, we'll construct a model that represents the individual opportunity. What does good look like? What does it take to succeed? So if I was looking to break down a contract opportunity, okay, what are the critical success factors that I would expect someone to be a successful bidder? What would they need to be able to do and demonstrate to the agency that they're pitching to, they're proposing to? Do intelligence collection to try to fill the gaps in that model, to collect information, then make sense out of it, and then deliver. So really, when you get into the black hat part, you've done likely a model, you've done the collection to a high degree, you're getting into the analysis function to make sense out of, here's what I think we know, and now let's deliver this, get into the production phase. So we're getting pretty in the weeds, as you can tell. I mean, I'll use some basic things, right? I call people, process, tools, and past performance. PPTP is a very simple way to break down a competitor. Who do they have on their payroll? That's important. What are the processes and tools about them that might arguably be unique, that score some strengths in evaluation? I'm going to look at their past performance. What can I derive from that? Not just like, well, what are the C parts? You don't know that. You can maybe you can do some snooping and get a feel for it, but it's actually more important to understand, where can I reasonably assume they have knowledge and strengths, or maybe some gaps that I can begin to exploit. There's a lot of other things you get into as a competitor. That's the most basic construct you can do, is PPTP, people, process, tools, past performance. So we'll produce like 20, 25, 30-page analyses of each business that we're looking at, really break down who what they are, because that's important, because it fuels the black hat. It's like anything else. If you're going to bake a cake, are you going to get terrible ingredients? No. You want to line up your ingredients. I'm going to make sure it's going to do what you want to do. No different here. You put the work in, and the work you put into it will make that analysis all the more effective, because then the team who's operating that black hat, they have what they happen to know up here already, which they should know something, and then use that to spark ideas, to spark lines of analysis, to spark lines of questions, and then also help plug in good gaps in their own knowledge. So I didn't know company X could do this. That changed my whole worldview on who they really are. So it helps to spark it. So we get pretty intense to make this work, because you can't just go in there and wing it. If you go in there and wing it, it's going to be a train wreck. It's going to be an absolute train wreck and a total waste of time for everybody involved. If you just go in there and wing it, it comes down to what I call bog sat, bunch of guys sitting around a table, which is totally worthless. So bog sat is not effective, but that's often what they turn into.
That's funny. So what value would you say this provides to businesses of any size when they're going through the capture and proposal process?
Yeah, it adds a lot of value, because I think it fosters critical thinking about what they're really up against. Because odds are, if you're going to go compete for a contract, you're not going to do so because you think that you don't have a shot. And many of these teams are sometimes a little bit over proud of themselves about how fantastic they think that they are. I think that this exercise is really this very rigorous analytical technique that you engage in. It makes you be more objective, because when I do a black hat, my objective, I'm going to scare the hell out of you. I'm coming for you. I'm not pulling punches. I'm going to show what the competition can do. And often people come out of those things going, oh my God, this is what we're up against? Yeah. Now, is that how things will play out? Not necessarily. It might. But the value there is to make them think objectively. I've always found that when I dig deep into a competitor, enter and live in their mind rent free for a little while to understand how they would operate, how they could think, that helps me think more critically about what they're really capable of doing. And then I reflect that back on my own solution. Okay, I can see now I've got some gaps. I can see now that maybe what I thought was fantastic is frankly just table stakes stuff. This is not that big of a deal. So it makes you then focus your solution where you will probably discover, hey, I've got 10 strengths. I'm going to just kick butt and take names. At the end of it, I got maybe 3. But then you know where to double down. This is what stands out for me. I need to double down here and go forward. So it does help the team, I think, come out of that with a lot more clarity and confidence and focus on what they need to do. That's how, when you do it right, that's actually how it turns out, as opposed to just checking the box and then moving on and everyone pats themselves on the back saying how wonderful they are, which is often not the case.
When would you advise, and I'm a little more biased to small businesses, so I'm going to ask
Sure,
you this about small businesses.
sure.
When would you advise for small businesses to like consider applying a black hat review?
Yeah, it's not a there's not really a specific time. It's really I would be very reluctant to do one of these things when you just start a capture effort because it's too early. Because if you don't have your own solution to test it against, that solution that's been vetted with the customer, that you feel confident you've refined pretty well, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be a pretty well developed story. Once you have that done and you think you have some level of confidence of who you're up against, and ideally you're still ideally several months away from the actual RFP, then it's time to do that. Because if you do a black hat and the RFP is imminent, it's going to arrive any day now. Well, what are you going to do with it? It's like being told you've got a terminal disease and you're going to drop dead tomorrow. I'd rather just go blissfully into the abyss. Frankly, I don't want to know and have that hanging over my head. It also because it doesn't give you time to actually pivot, make any adjustments. It's like, okay, well, I know I'm screwed. What's the point? I I think to make sure you can do that and then have at least a few months of time between now and when the RFP is going to come out to make some adjustments, teaming solutions, key hires that may be amiss, or just frankly have a chance to tune up their own solution. That's really important to do that. So I get these calls sometimes where I have to ask the question of, sounds great. This looks like a good fit. By the way, when do you think that RFP is coming out? Oh, next week. Okay. I'll sometimes say you realize that you're kind of asking for a tummy tuck when you're bleeding out in your femoral artery. You're you're it's too little too late, right? You're in the ER looking for a little bit of a nip tuck there. No, you have bigger problems. So you focus on just what you're going to do and just hope for the best because it's too little too late at this point.
That makes sense because, I mean, if you're a couple months out, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of, what you
Right.
can change versus when, the RFP drops, the dates are pretty tough. Sometimes there is a little bit of leniency if you ask for an extension, but it's not like you're going to get like a 3 month extension. You'll get like a couple of weeks, and
Right.
what can you really do in a couple of weeks
Not
versus
much.
a couple of months? So that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why this just came to me, but I'm curious. Have you ever followed up with a client after the fact? Like they did the review with you, they submitted,
Mhm.
and then they didn't win. And then some of the points that were made in the Black Hat review were part of the debrief. Like I'm just kind of curious because I know it goes on in a debrief and what we
Sure.
give as like you did this really well and this is something you could work on. Have you followed up with your clients to find out like how things went and then like, what they took away from that?
Yeah, well, the black hat is more an outside kind of inside looking out exercise. So
Mhm.
it's more on a measure, well, do we know who finally made the bid? And then I think beyond that, how did you store compare to them and where do they get strengths or weaknesses as much as you can find? And that latter part might be difficult to surmise. Um,
Mhm.
it is useful when I do reach out to them when they're willing to chat about what happened afterwards to say, okay, well, how close was it to reality, right? What was the miss? And then to learn from what the miss was. Sometimes it's a matter. It's one thing that's difficult to measure though is someone's will to win or will to bid. We may look at someone and we may assess that, holy smokes, these guys, they're going to be a tough competitor. And then they decide at the last minute where I go, yeah, I'm going to pass. What? Um, because they may have other priorities. They may have limited resources. They may have to just make some decisions that who knows what's actually going to play out. But it is interesting to see the difference, and then what can we learn from those debriefs? What can we learn from the protests that are out there that are related to procurements we were involved with of how things played out? It's always a learning experience for us as well to see, did we miss something? Often what the issue is it may have been a fundamental misunderstanding across the board about what the issue was for the customer. So when you create that model that I mentioned earlier on, you're trying to understand what's in the mind of this agency, what's the itch that they're trying to scratch. If you miss the itch they're trying to scratch, then unfortunately the model that you're using to start it is already flawed. So you're operating with frankly flawed intelligence, and that's difficult to overcome. You do the best you can, because you have to accept there'll be gaps in intelligence, but it is always a learning experience to see what could we have learned from that experience, and then how do we tune things up the next go around.
I don't know why I thought about that, but I would be really curious to see, and you're right, you can only see where you fared in terms of the successful. So you have a very limited, snapshot of, okay, well, how did I match up versus,
Right.
this person? But I am curious, is there something that you offered client and they didn't take it, or, we suggested that and that was something that, maybe you didn't take, and that's something you got dinged on, or something maybe that they took your advice on and then that made the difference. So I don't know, I'm always really curious, like the out brief, like after
Yeah,
the fact.
it it is interesting because when we do these things, we'd really spend, and this is a lesson I learned the hard way earlier in my career, when we do these black reviews, and there'd be a group of people working on it, and then everyone goes, "Oh wow, that was great. We learned a lot. Holy cow!" And then within a few days, everyone's forgotten what's been learned. So just go. So we actually make it a practice to wrap the things up at the end with, here's everything we learned, and here are some definitive threats that we are concerned about based on the analysis that was conducted. And what's interesting though is this is the biggest thing I see companies do, where they take all this and go, "This is great, and then they're so anchored in some other concept that no matter what you do, even if you grab them by the shoulders and shake them vigorously, are you listening? This is the problem." Sometimes they're already so invested in some mode of thinking that they ignore it. They utterly ignore the intelligence that's right there in front of them, because it puts them in a bad light. And I may have to say, listen, in this competition, out of 5 competitors we're looking at, you're probably number 3 at best on a good day. There's 2, they're so purpose built to win this thing that you're operating at a very big disadvantage, and they don't want. And some actually appreciate, you know what, you're right, a little band, like, we're out. This is not worth the juice is not worth the squeeze. But where the things go wrong, one of the biggest things that happens is, here's the analysis, we played it out, and they just ignore it. Like, well, I can even see that happening during the debrief sometimes, where I remember one particular large company doing a major recompete, and it was eye-opening for me, the weird sort of Stockholm syndrome going on there, where their own analysis working with my team, okay, these 2 competitors are the apex predators in this match. And then they started talking themselves out of it. They started backing out, well, but this, and it's what I'll call the yeah buts. Yeah, but, like, okay, we've got the yeah buts going on here, or the wells. We're doing well diving now. Okay, great. I had to walk up the front rim and point. Our collective analysis says these 2 are your biggest threats. You're backing up on that. You do so at your own caution and your own peril. Don't do that. Doesn't mean you can't win. Just means you need to pay attention to what you're up against and make some adjustments. You are well within your rights to win this again. Absolutely. Guys know what you're doing here, but these guys have some better mousetraps now than they did 5 years ago. It's not what it was 5 years ago. It's a bold new world. You need to adapt and overcome. Semper Gundy, always flexible. And that's, I had to kind of shake them. They won in the end, which is great. But it was sort of a scared straight moment that I had to do, which I didn't enjoy doing, but I didn't want all that work to go to waste and then watch them lose. That would have really been a shame. It would have bugged me for a long time, like, just to say, can't be silent. Sorry, I guess I'll be the jerk in the room and point out the obvious.
Like sometimes they need to hear that though. It's like, and I
Yeah,
mean, you're right though. Like there are times when, you can't tell, you can give suggestions and feedback, but if they have a business, it's their business decision on how they want to go forward, but then they have to
it
live
is.
with whatever they chose to do or not to do. So that's so interesting though. I know you've done so many of these. I mean, one day when I'm not a Fed anymore, maybe I can like be a fly on the wall because I keep just envisioning like the war room. That's what I'm like envisioning this like being, and it just sounds really fascinating to me. So I'm like, ooh, like what would that be like? But unfortunately, I can't do that yet. But um, I know I've asked you this before because you've been on the show before, but if there was any advice you would give to either small businesses that are just starting out or, you know, people that haven't been in GovCon but are considering like, "Ooh, that would be something interesting for me to do." Like, what would you say to them?
I think that this is something that people will cut corners on quite a lot in terms of doing a really sober assessment of the competition. And I think that often it's a matter of maybe you're not willing to admit that you're not the coolest kid in the round.
Mhm.
So doing this type of exercise and coming to terms with you may have some gaps of your own is a tough thing to do. No one wants to say their baby's ugly, but sometimes your baby is ugly and you have to deal with it. But there's a way to reform that and then and get back on track. But you have to admit that, and that's the best way to learn. Because I'll tell you what, learning from losses is expensive. It's also demoralizing. When you have a string of
Mhm.
losses, it just beats down yourself, it beats down your team. So to use something like this basic construct or some form of it, whether it be a diet version or the full on the full thing, is useful to foster critical thinking because that's the best way to invest in yourself is critical thinking and being honest with yourself. Um, Walking away from a pursuit, it's I remind people that it's okay to walk away, and sometimes that's the best decision you can make. So no one wants to do that because you get invested emotionally, you get financially invested, but that's a sunk cost fallacy. So accept that sometimes it's better to walk away from a deal, but using types of exercises like these is really critical just to foster critical thinking. And it's a hard thing to do, but it's well worth the investment of time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And it's I think important because you can learn a lot about your business and, you know, is what you're
Mm.
offering, you know, something that's beneficial or do you need to make a pivot? And, you know, if you made a pivot, would that be a better option for you, you know, depending on who else is in that market? So,
Right.
no, I love this whole idea. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, very simple. Email address, just my first name, last name, Brian.Lindholm at fedsavvystrategies.com, or just go to the website, fedsavvystrategies.com. We got lots of free blogs and content there for you to peruse and enjoy your reading pleasure, or if you have maybe insomnia, I guess either way you want to look at it. But check us out there. Either way, I'm easy to reach, or just hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm probably on LinkedIn way too damn much, but it's an occupational hazard based on what I do. So no, and thanks for having me again on. I really appreciate this. It's always good to chat with you.
Of course, yeah. I will link all of Brian's information. And just a shameless plug, but Brian and I are actually going to be recording in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be talking about protests. And it's been really interesting to talk about this with Brian on a couple of different panels. But we're going to look at, you know, risk and you know all of the different things that you can learn out of losing or winning. But protests, if you don't use them or look at them already, you should. They're free and they're publicly available. You can look at, you know, why a company won or why they didn't win and why the government said you need to go back and rethink this and just some things to maybe consider so that you don't make the same mistakes. But if there was anything that Brian talked about that you want more information about, or if there's a topic that I haven't talked about yet that you really, really want to hear about, please email me at breakingthestandard@gmail.com and make sure to go follow and subscribe either on Apple or Spotify. And we're now on YouTube. So until next time, bye.